guest this evening is somebody I've had on my show several times. I thoroughly enjoy his company, his information. He's wise, educated. Is Jason Jarrell. Let me give you his bio here. Jason Jarrell has been studying prehistoric civilizations and the Nephilim for 17 years. During the last 6 years, he and his wife Sarah have been involved in an independent investigation of the Adena culture of North American mound builders. Over the course of their research, they have studied over 100 years of literature, including archaeological reports from North America, Europe, and the ancient East, as well as the writings of 19th century antiquarians. His website is AlleghenyMounds.com. And please welcome Jason to the show this evening. Hello, Jason.
Hello, Solaris. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Well, likewise, Mutual Admiration Society. It's a pleasure to have you on. And once again, we were kind of texting prior a couple of weeks ago about the remember the 5th of November, of course. And since this is November 5th, I'm going to give you the floor insofar as what you'd like to discuss first, and we'll just play it by ear.
Well, we can discuss the archaeological research for a while, and then if you would like to, perhaps we can address our situation in this country later in the show by placing it into the perspective of the history of civilization.
Sounds perfect. Okay. All right. Well, let's dive into the archaeological aspects and let everybody know what you've been working on recently.
Well, I've been working with my wife, Sarah, for the last 7 years now on an independent review of the archaeology of North America and the Old World, including Central and Western Europe, as well as the Middle East. And the objective of this project has been to present a new view, a new perspective or interpretation of ancient history that restores several critical elements to our ancient history that have been either neglected or intentionally swept under the rug. And among those elements, which are various features that we refer to as a greater prehistoric reality, are the fact that there were ancient globalizations in our distant past, and there were a group of beings with a very distinct anthropology. And these beings over the last few years have been popularized in television shows, documentaries, and several books as the ancient North American giants. And so our research centers around these concepts, and we have a book that's just about finished. That'll be out in the first quarter of next year. And the book is going to contain a new outline of 7,000 years of world history that restores these elements to the narrative of this planet's ancient past.
Wow. Awesome. That's amazing. 7,000 years. That's incredible. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, we have an appendix about the Upper Paleolithic period, so I guess you could say that it actually has around 30,000 years.
Nice.
So at the center of this mystery is the fact that in the 19th and the early 20th centuries, press reports and local township and county histories, as well as antiquarian journals. Antiquarians, by the way, were the first real archaeologists. There's nothing about the antiquarians that would really separate them from the practice of archaeology, except their methods were somewhat more primitive than what we practice with today. But these sources recorded the discovery of unusually large skeletal remains from burial mounds and other types of prehistoric tombs in North America. And many of the old accounts describe skeletons ranging between 7 and 8 feet in height, while a lesser number of reliable reports actually mention individuals approaching 9 feet or above. And these unusual skeletons were frequently described as having large, thick skulls with powerful lower jaw bones, and on occasion, supernumerary teeth. And the early settlers used to pull the jawbones off out of these tombs and place them over their own faces like masks. So what happened is, in North America, as these remains were frequently found through tillage and also through recreation, because many Americans considered the opening of burial mounds to be a type of recreation. Things began to change, and people began to understand that very large individuals were a part of the ancient past. And in the history of Lorain County, Ohio, the Williams brothers wrote that a veil of impenetrable mystery hung over the Ohio Valley at this time, because according to them, the skeletal remains of human beings of such dimensions as to show that their one-time possessors were beings of almost gigantic proportions were exhumed from their ancient cemeteries by the first settlers. And so post-Revolutionary War development enhanced this mystery, because the true extent of the earthworks in the Ohio Valley was realized when Congress passed the Internal Improvement of Canals Act in 1825, which created the Ohio and Miami canals. Over 3,000 burial mounds were discovered for the first time. And you can look at several old history books from the time period, and there's usually a note regarding this moment in history. And here's one from the History of Seneca County, Ohio, by Michael Leeson. It was published in 1886. It says that at this point, the curiosities which attracted antiquarians and scientists in the state of Ohio were found in various places, as relics were discovered that must have belonged to a giant race. So we know that the tall ones, which were called the mound builders in those days, the tall ones actually were entered into the historical record. This is very important. It's very important that people understand that by the late 1800s, their existence was a historical fact. They were placed on display in many museums, including in Marshall County, West Virginia, in museums in Indiana, and museums in Ohio. They were excavated not just by the hundreds, but by the thousands in the states in the Ohio Valley. And I just want to add that even though these types of beings have been found all over the world, there has nowhere ever been found as high a concentration as in the North American states of Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia. So, in 1879, events were underway which had, in my opinion, a devastating impact on the twin disciples of archaeology and anthropology in the United States, because this was the year that an act of Congress established the Bureau of Ethnology of the Smithsonian Institution. And initially, the Bureau was only created to study living North American tribes. But in February of 1881, Congress modified the act that created the Bureau of Ethnology, allotting $5,000 a year, which, in the words of Congress, shall be expended in archaeological investigation relating to the mound builders. So there was pressure from the federal government of the United States to direct the Smithsonian to the excavation and the acquiring of artifacts from the burial mounds in the Ohio Valley beginning in 1881, and the Eastern Mound Division of the Smithsonian was born. And during the 1880s, the Eastern Mound Division excavated over 1,000 burial mounds in the Ohio Valley and elsewhere in North America. And during this time period, the Smithsonian itself absolutely did, with no question, they absolutely did discover for themselves and record gigantic human skeletons.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
And we know this from their own reports.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the skeptics, and there are plenty of skeptics, we have people today who make a living as online personalities who are skeptical of this type of research or any other kind of research, really. I have several friends, including Gary David and Ross Hamilton, who could explain to you how that virtually any alternative theory of our prehistory is essentially roundly rejected without really any kind of accurate review. And one of the things that the skeptics like to say is that these old accounts, especially the ones from the newspapers, are inaccurate or somehow faulty, or perhaps they were yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, for those who don't know, is the practice of inventing sensationalist stories in order to sell newspapers. So in order to refute that on air tonight, I would like to review a couple of instances when the newspaper articles are 100% right, if that's okay with you.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, we can start with one from the town that I live in here in Charleston, West Virginia. For those who don't know, there were several major centers of activity of the Mound builders. Charleston, West Virginia was one. In 1883 and 1884, the Smithsonian Institution sent an agent named Colonel Norris to excavate 50 burial mounds, 10 hingiform enclosures, and 64 stone mounds here in Charleston, West Virginia. It was a city of the dead. And in the New York Times, on November the 20th, 1883, an article appeared about a burial mound excavated in Charleston. And according to the article, a burial mound on the Smith farm was excavated by Colonel Norris of the Smithsonian, and within a timber chamber inside of that mound on the Smith farm, Colonel Norris discovered a 7-foot-long skeleton. So Colonel Norris filed an actual report for this mound with the Smithsonian, and anyone can access this very report on archive.org in the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, the Smithsonian. And in that report, reporting on the Great Smith Mound on the Smith farm, just as the article states, Colonel Norris enters this passage. At 19 feet, at the bottom of a debris pile, we find, together with the fragments of a rotten bark coffin, a gigantic human skeleton 7 feet 6 inches in length and 19 inches between the coaxials of the shoulders. So in this instance, the newspaper article is not only accurate, but the skeleton was actually larger than it's reported in the press article, and that's very important, because typically it's usual that people dismiss those articles as exaggerations. But in this instance, and many others we found, the actual size of the bones is larger than what the press recorded. And I can offer another example from Ohio. It wasn't just the Smithsonian during this time period that discovered the tall ones. The Antiquarians were finding them all the time. In the Daily Public Ledger for May 31st, 1897, this article I'm about to quote appeared. Near Chillicothe, Ohio, 10 skeletons were found in 2 mounds by Dr. Loveberry, curator of the Ohio State University Museum. One was that of a giant fully 8 feet tall. It is the most notable find yet. Following the dating of this article, Loveberry, this was Clarence Loveberry, he did, in fact, excavate 2 burial mounds on the Briggs farm in the last week of May 1897, and he did file an actual report with the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society, and this appears in the 7th volume of their collected publications, describing the burial from the newspaper. Loveberry states, "The bones were the largest I ever removed from a mound. All joints were exceedingly massive, and the muscular attachments were wonderfully developed. Badly decayed as it was, the longer bones were sound enough to make these observations. Now, while this entry doesn't give us a specific length of the skeleton, I think it's pretty undeniable that someone very large was found in Loveberry's description. In fact, it seems obvious that this is the skeleton described in the press report.
Mm-hmm.
So these are just two examples that I wanted to share in which the numerous local histories and newspaper accounts out there can be verified in the actual archaeological record, and our book has dozens of instances such as this one where licensed archaeologists or antiquarians in their own reports verify the existence of large remains, which also appear in press accounts. And so in the 1880s, the Smithsonian recorded numerous large skeletons themselves. In the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology alone, there are 17 gigantic skeletons mentioned. And at this point, the Smithsonian actually had no problem acknowledging that these remains were being found. They appear in their published reports. The Smithsonian agents working in the field frequently spoke with historians and reporters about the large remains. And it wasn't until the early 1900s that the policy of denial was instituted at the Smithsonian by a man named Elis Hrdlicka. Hrdlicka was the curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution. And Hrdlicka was the word that most people use, academics use, describing Hrdlicka is a bully. Hrdlicka publicly intimidated other academics if they disagreed with his dogmas and policies. And for example, he insisted that man had only been in America for 3,000 years. Well, this is absurd, of course, it's absurd. Mm-hmm. But during Hrdlicka's tenure at the Smithsonian, no one in the United States would dare suggest man had been in America for longer than 3,000 years because Hrdlicka had a certain amount of power over the university circuit, and the professors didn't want to risk crossing him. Now, Hrdlicka was the first giants denier. In fact, he, in many of his reports, his own anthropological reports, he constantly disparages people who, at that time, the American citizenry was frequently questioning the Smithsonian officials about large skeletal remains because, as we mentioned earlier, by the late 1800s, everyone knew about them. And Hrdlicka was the first person to dump the large skeletons into America's memory hole. And the key to understanding Hrdlicka is that he was a prominent member of an organization known as the American Eugenics Society. Now, the American Eugenics Society was an organization funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Institute, and the Harriman family. The American Eugenics Society took over the country in the early 1900s, and their purpose was the eradication of all people who were not of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon descent. And this included the total elimination of Native Americans, African Americans, Southern Italians, East Europeans, Jews, Hispanics, and any Caucasians with more than one generation of poverty in their family history. The American Eugenics Society targeted over 14 million Americans for extermination. Some of their methods and practices include the sterilization of 60,000 people in 27 states by coercive methods. The medical establishment engaged in lethal neglect and outright murder. Doctors who were affiliated with the society would refuse to treat patients and save their lives if they felt like they were of an inferior racial stock. In Lincoln, Illinois, the Institute for the Feeble-Minded fed patients milk from a herd of cattle infected with tuberculosis, a practice that spread to other mental institutions, increasing the mortality rates by 40%. And in 1911, and this is a matter of public record, I encourage everyone to please double-check all my facts. In 1911, the Carnegie Institute, the United States Department of Agriculture, and the American Breeders Association worked together outlining plans for the painless killing of individuals deemed unworthy of life in public lethal gas chambers.
Wow.
And it was at this point that the Carnegie Institute, working with the Eugenics Record Office, targeted the entire population of Native Americans for complete extermination. There's an excellent book called War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. I encourage anyone who's interested in this very overlooked part of our national history to check this book out, because it has powerful ramifications for our situation today.
Mm-hmm.
So Ross Hamilton has suggested that the American eugenicists may have concealed the tall ones through the Smithsonian because the existence of a superior race ancestral to First Nations people would contradict eugenics dogma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a distinct possibility, and it probably was a motive for many of the anthropologists working with the eugenicist mindset. However, I personally believe there's another possible motive for why the eugenicists would have concealed this history from mankind. But what's important is, following the reign of Bailey Hrdlicka, there was a danger that the knowledge of the tall ones would be lost forever. But what actually occurred was that fate intervened, and several decades after the cover-up, they were rediscovered in the Ohio Valley by mainstream archaeologists who put them back on record in the 20th century. And the first archaeologist to do so was from the University of Kentucky, and his name was William S. Webb. Now, the mound-building culture that most of the gigantic skeletons came from is known today, archaeologically, as the Adena culture. The Adena were the first constructors of earthworks and burial mounds in the Ohio Valley, and the conventional dating for them that most mainstream archaeologists use is between 900 BC and 200 AD. In our research, we found evidence that could push their culture back to 2200 BC. But just for the time being, we'll use the conventional dating. Now, William S. Webb worked with a physical anthropologist named Charles Snow to reconstruct the anthropology of the Adena people. And Webb and Snow acknowledged large skeletons from Adena tombs, which is quite remarkable for this to be happening again. Mm-hmm. According to Webb and Snow, the Adena people were completely distinct from the preceding Archaic, as well as later Hopewell and Fort Ancient people. Webb and Snow considered the Adena to be an intrusive population that came into North America from elsewhere. And according to their analysis, the Adena possessed very wide, bony chins, massive and very powerful lower jaws, pronounced brow ridges, and high vaulted skulls. And the skulls were artificially enhanced through cranial deformation, which flattened the occipital region at the back of the skull. Now, these are all features that you can find in the early accounts of Adena. Mm-hmm. So, in essence, this anthropology confirmed what many of the earlier antiquarians and historians were saying about these large skeletons with the massive jawbones. So Webb himself actually discovered occasional large skeletons, At the Dover Mound in Mason County, Kentucky, Webb discovered near the top of the mound a group burial of 4 individuals, and one of these burials was numbered burial number 40, and this is a quote from Webb. "The remains of burial 40 is one of the largest known to Adena. The skull-to-foot field measurement is 84 inches. Now, that's an individual who is 7 feet tall.
Mm-hmm.
Now, following in Webb's footsteps, the second great Adena scholar was Don Dragoo from the Carnegie Museum. Dragoo was actually the person who outlined the entire cultural sequence of the Adena culture as we study it today in archaeology in his classic book, Mounds for the Dead, published in 1963. And Dragoo followed up on Webb and Snow's Adena anthropology studies, and Dragoo also acknowledged very large skeletons from Adena tombs. In fact, while excavating the Cresap Mound here in West Virginia, Dragoo encountered burial 54, which was the primary burial beneath the mound, and this is a quote from Dragoo's excavation report. "This individual was of large proportions. When measured in the tomb, his length was approximately 7.04 feet. All the long bones were heavy and possessed marked eminences for the attachment of muscles." Now, studying the history of the large physical types, Dragoo determined that they were a unique group of very honored dead, a sort of a subgroup which existed among the Adena people who demonstrated these extraordinary physical traits. And he believed that the tall ones from the Adena mounds were an elite group who practiced targeted breeding, similar to the way that royalty or other chiefly societies always have around the world. Webb, Snow, and Dragoo all three concluded that it was actually impossible to know just how many people in the Adena civilization possessed the extreme height because of the widespread practice of cremation. Cremation makes it very difficult for us to determine the size and the robustness of an individual, but they did determine that many of the bones that survived the cremation process had the unique characteristics. So that would mean that there were even more of these tall individuals than we do have reference to in historical record.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the story of the discovery, the obfuscation, and then rediscovery of the tall ones.
Mm-hmm. Yes, fascinating. We had a question here from Zippy in the chat room. Were there any large weapons found with the giants?
Well, you know, it's very interesting that with the tall ones, we find occasional mention of things from Ohio, such as 39-pound axes.
Mm-hmm.
We know that around the Great Lakes there were some enormous hammers that were used for mining copper. But usually with the honored dead, what we have are status artifacts. We have gorgets, beads, copper breastplates. There was an individual reaching about 7 feet in height from a mound at Charleston, West Virginia, who was buried with a copper diadem crown. There were copper crowns, copper antler headdresses. And in terms of large weapons, we really don't see things like people would imagine with some of the more sensationalist books and things like that about giants out there. We don't see the double-sided 30-foot high battle axes. What we see are symbolic artifacts. Mm-hmm. For example, in Europe, many of the giants that have been found in the mounds of Europe, they were buried with copper daggers. And it wasn't because they used those copper daggers every day. It was because that copper dagger, it meant something in their society. With the Adena mounds, we find large stemmed points or blades, and sometimes they are oversized bifaces. So in terms of weaponry, we don't really see much weaponry. We see prestige artifacts, the types of things that royals would be buried with today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. So obviously, you said that they were a lot of them were being cremated, but the ones that weren't cremated, did they find them in coffins or were they just buried?
That's a fantastic question. You think like an archaeologist.
Oh, well, thank you.
The There are several fantastic examples of the tombs that these people built. Adena sometimes buried their dead in subsurface pit graves beneath the mounds. They also buried people stratigraphically throughout the mound. But they also practiced more elaborate tomb construction. They constructed large timber chambers inside the mounds, and some of these were so large that they're basically like a room of your house. And in 3 mounds here in Charleston, the Adena constructed full log cabins with multiple burials inside, complete with bark-covered floors and ridged roofs inside the mounds as burial chambers. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, and in a few instances in West Virginia, the Adena occasionally constructed stone kists and megalithic tombs. There was a mound in Fayette County, West Virginia, that was about 12 feet high, made of stone, and it actually had a passageway leading from the outside to the interior of the mound.
Wow.
There's a mound from the Wolf's Plains in Athens, Ohio, called the Coon Mound, that not only featured an interior timber room featuring burials, but also had a passageway that was lined with logs that led to the outside of the mound from the inner chamber. So it's very unfortunate in my mind that most Americans have no idea the elaborate construction of this culture and the types of mounds and burials and tombs that were found right here in North America. It's one of the greatest blind spots in prehistory around the world.
It certainly is. You know, it's really interesting. We were talking about these. It sounds like they had like the full log cabins inside. Do you think they were actually living in those, or were they specifically done and created so that they could be buried in them?
No, I do not believe they lived inside the structures. Now, there used to be a theory that, and this was actually one of William S. Webb's original theories. There was once a theory that the mound was built over the chief's house when the chief died, but that theory is long gone. Mm-hmm. They were building these structures specifically because of the religion around their very elaborate cult of the dead. And while they were able to build these log structures inside these mounds, the archaeologists have never bothered to entertain the idea that maybe they built similar structures to live in elsewhere. Mm-hmm. In fact, their habitation sites remain elusive. We can find cooking sites. We've found sites where the Adena made their wonderful bifaces and stemmed points. We found sites with broken pottery sherds, but a very conclusive find of a full Adena village, in my opinion, I haven't seen any evidence that supports that they actually know how these people lived as much as we know how they were buried.
Wow.
The sites where we find their massive hinges, their circular hinges made of earthen walls with interior ditches, often aligned to solar and lunar events, are usually in the same area as large aggregates of their mounds. But they did not live in these areas. There are entire cities in the Ohio Valley that are built on top of massive groups of earthworks constructed by these people. And although they buried their dead there, and although they likely had ceremonies there, they did not live there. These grounds were set aside for special purposes.
That's fascinating. So what does your intuition tell you? What does it tell you? Where do you think they lived, or how do you think they lived? Do you have any idea intuitively?
I think that I don't know.
Okay. I'm just curious because... Oh, go ahead.
I know that they practiced a form of agriculture
Mm-hmm.
that is increasingly marginalized by modern anthropology. They don't want there to be, the mainstream doesn't seem to want to see advanced agriculture in America's prehistory that far back, but it was there. They cultivated corn by 300 BC. They had squash. They hunted deer. One thing that I do know about is their socio-political system, because there's been a good deal of excellent study done in the last 2 decades about that, and that's very interesting to me, because at roughly the same time that the tall ones appear in the archaeological record, for whatever the reason, the ancient people of North America, after thousands of years of a reciprocal trade system and a bartering system, suddenly found themselves dominated by what's known as a political economy. In a political economy, a small number of individuals that are called in the record big men or aggrandizers control essential resources and valuable goods through regional interaction centers. And it's usually through a political economy model of society that chiefs and elites rise to power. And although there's a movement today to deny that there were chiefs among the ancient American mound builders, there's just too much research that's been done in Kentucky and West Virginia that suggests otherwise to convince me. There were chiefly lineages who were controlling the economy of the Ohio Valley 3,000 years ago.
Wow.
And among these chiefly lineages were the bloodlines of the tall ones.
That's very interesting. This is amazing. When you look at all this data. Go ahead.
You know, it's very interesting to me that all around the world, looking at archaeology from a global perspective, all around the world, elitism is always born the same way in the archaeological record. In Europe, at the dawn of the Bronze Age, the Neolithic people were getting along just fine without advanced social organization. And around 2500 BC, we see the appearance of a political economy in Europe, in Western Europe and Central Europe, and this gives rise to chiefs and elitism there as well. So historically, we as a species have always lost our sovereignty due to economics, not through armies, not through weapons, not through giant battle axes, but through economic warfare. We have always been subjugated.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Wow. An interesting pattern, isn't it?
It certainly is. And it repeats itself many times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems like it has. There's no doubt about that one. So insofar as these particular beings, I don't know what you want to call them, besides the Adena, what do you think their essence is? What location do you think they originated from? Obviously, not here. They showed up here, but where do you think they were really from?
Well, there's always been different theories of where they were from. William S. Webb and Charles Snow believe they were from Mexico, from South America.
Mm-hmm.
The modern archaeologists, of course, don't even consider it to be a mystery. They consider them to have simply been the ancestors of Native Americans, and they are ancestral to some Native Americans. In the 1800s, the earliest people who studied this culture believed that they had come from the old world somewhere. And there is a remarkable cultural uniformity as well as an anthropological similarity to various cultures stretching all the way back through time into Europe and from Europe back into the ancient East. So it's possible that we're looking at what essentially amounts to a super race that in the distant past spread out over large parts of the world. Because the same MO is there, the same type of economic system, the same type of elitism and chiefly lineages, the same anthropology, the same tall skeletons. And you can trace it literally back through time, thousands of years, which is actually what our book does.
Mm-hmm.
And then, alternatively, there are people like my friend and mentor, Ross Hamilton. Ross believes that they originated here and may have affected the rest of the world from the vantage point of ancient North America, which is an equally valid viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Our job in the alternative research community, there are two different camps of people. There are people who actually believe that they're going to convince mainstream archaeology of their own viewpoint. They look at this information, they believe they're absolutely right, whatever their theory is, and then it becomes their purpose in life to have some archaeologists tell them, yes, you were correct. But that's not going to happen. The establishment is impervious to change.
Mm-hmm.
The other school is people like myself. Our job isn't to be 100% correct in the long run. Our job is to present alternate possibilities. Because what's going to happen is, in a few decades, it may be 20 or 30 years, it may be sooner, the mainstream paradigm of North American archaeology is going to collapse. Mm-hmm. It's already cracked to the point that it can barely sustain itself without using fraud, slander, and lies. Mm-hmm. It will eventually collapse. And our real purpose is to make sure that when it does, there are numerous alternative possibilities, and there's well-documented data for the next generation of archaeologists and anthropologists to look at, so that they can see where most of us were right, where some of us were wrong. And because they'll probably have more access to more information, they'll probably get the big picture in a way that we can't.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, I like the way you're leaving a benchmark for them. That gives them something to work with, especially your work and your research. You and Sarah have done a phenomenal job. You really have.
Well, that's the reason that, we meant to have our book finished this time last year. But one of the things that we set out to do with this book was to make sure that everything was very well referenced. This book references over 1,000 scientific and academic papers. Most of the chapters, 99% of the references are archaeological reports or old Smithsonian papers. Most of this is mainstream. There is no Graham Hancock in this book. Mm-hmm. And the reason we're doing it that way is so that people in the future can reference everything we say, find the original source, and decide what they think about it.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, I like that idea. Well, like I said, it's more solid to some degree, but I still wonder how much of that has been skewed. Even the old archives of information, I wonder how much of that has been sort of censored.
Well, I can give you a couple of insights just from West Virginia. Well, let me rewind for a minute. I've done several public conferences over the last year on the tall ones. And after one of these conferences in Ohio, there was an archaeologist who approached me and my team. And he had been doing archaeology his whole life, and he was retired, but he had worked on his first mound excavation when he was 10 years old in Ohio. Mm. And he approached us, and he wanted to tell us a story, and he was talking about how in the 1960s, he was working on a mound dig in Ohio with a very prominent archaeologist from the time period known as Raymond F. Bobby. Most people that know archaeology will recognize Bobby's name. So he was excavating a mound with Raymond Bobby. Well, they discovered one of these large skeletons in this mound. And he was explaining to us that it was of such little value to the archaeologist that Raymond Bobby threw it in the trash.
Oh, wow.
He also relayed a story about an 8'4" skeleton that had been found recently, actually, that they were not reporting because they didn't want to report the skeleton. It's that simple. If you have a monopoly on archaeology, you don't have to report anything. Wow. Especially if you are the only person who's licensed to dig in a grave in North America, if you are the only licensed archaeologist on a site, who's going to know what you find in a grave, really?
Mm-hmm.
There are numerous stories that are coming out now. For example, a large organization in Ohio, the Ohio Historical Society, it's recently come out that the Ohio Historical Society, decades ago, buried thousands of artifacts in a ditch and covered it up just because they had nowhere to store them.
Oh, my goodness.
So this is the type of field we're looking at here. The state of American archaeology, it's not like archaeology elsewhere, honestly. It's a unique thing. It's its own creature. I can share another story.
Mm-hmm.
After another of my presentations, there was an instance when I was approached by an archaeologist who challenged me. He wanted my sources. And he said, there were witnesses there, he said that if the sources checked out, he would publish that this information was accurate and that these people had been found.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave him my sources, and I waited several weeks for him to double check, and then I heard from him, and he said, check your sources, and they all checked out. You're right. There's no reason to doubt the measurements, but I'm still not going to publish it because I don't see why it means anything.
Oh, gee.
Well, that's where we differ. That's where my people, my team, and myself, that's where we differ from mainstream archaeologists. It's not my job to tell you whether or not something should mean something to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly not my job to keep something from you because I don't feel like it means anything.
Right. It's called integrity, Jason. You know?
I don't know what it's called, but
well, it's kind of frustrating when you think about what these guys are doing. And that's just, once again, I'm so glad that you're doing the work you're doing with you and Sarah, because these people don't seem to appreciate anything when it comes to history or artifacts or anything else. You know, I was really interested about that 8'4" skeleton. That's pretty big. Usually you're saying like 7 feet, but that's pretty tall.
There were a lesser number of them who were over 8 feet tall. Mm-hmm. And it's my belief that the older ones were the larger ones. Mm-hmm. There's a mound here in West Virginia that we published an investigation recently. You can read it online. It's called The Giants of Doddridge County. One of the mounds on a farm in Doddridge County, West Virginia, produced a skeleton that was 9 feet tall. But the artifacts with that skeleton in that mound were not Adena artifacts. They were artifacts from the Archaic period. That means that tall skeleton was probably older than the 7 to 8 foot tall Adena. So we may be looking at an instance where their gene pool became diluted and they lost some of their size as time passed on. But that's pure speculation on my part.
Mm-hmm. Right. What about lifespan? What do you think? How old do you think they lived, or how long?
I think some of them lived to be 90 years old,
mm-hmm.
as people would today, but I don't believe that they were living for hundreds of years.
Okay.
I studied the anthropological record. I find that they have age. Their teeth demonstrate age. Their jaws and their crania demonstrate age. They aged as we do. Or perhaps they aged as we do, but slower, and we do not accurately gauge their age when we look at those types of features.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say in all likelihood that they had the same type of lifespan that we do, but it would be the type of lifespan we have under optimal health.
Mm-hmm.
Not as we are today with the GMOs and the vaccines.
Right, sabotage.
Even the average Adena, who was 5'7", perhaps,
mm-hmm.
the average Adena was more powerfully built than we are today. Their bones were thicker. Their teeth were stronger. Many times they have perfect teeth when they're found in the tombs.
Mm-hmm.
Even the females were powerfully built individuals. In fact, at the Dover Mound in Kentucky, where one of Webb's 7-footers was found, many of the females were over 6 feet tall, and there have been many female giants found. There's one from Ohio that was buried in a gravel bank, a female that was 7'5". So we know that they were stronger than we are.
Right. Yeah, that certainly seems that way. What about children? Have you located any children?
Well, there are many child burials in the mounds. And the child burials oftentimes demonstrate evidence of status. Going back to the Archaic, we find child burials with special copper, special ornaments and items. So many children have been found. Essentially, there is an element of the fantastic among these people, but there's also an element of the human.
Right. And Jason, hold that thought. We're going to head for a break. Everybody, please stay tuned. You're listening to Ravenstar's Witching Hour. I'm Solaris BlueRaven. My excellent guest tonight is Jason Jarrell. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.